In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, Netherlands counted among the forefront countries which responded to the international humanitarian calls to help Rwanda overcome an unprecedented post-catastrophe crisis. Like many other international players on the ground at that time, the Netherlands, through direct bilateral aid and by way of multilateral support mechanisms, committed enormous resources to help Rwanda rise from its ashes. This was the period of implementation of the emergency assistance programs. The decision by the Dutch government for a prompt humanitarian intervention should be commended. Rwandans were in a bad need of urgent support after going through a despicable genocide nightmare. In November 2001, the Dutch Parliament decided to include Rwanda in the group of eligible recipient countries having the right to benefit from regular Dutch development cooperation. Arguably, that decision was essentially motivated by the requirement for reconstruction of vital institutions of a country which had nearly lost most of its important socio-economic infrastructures during the genocide.
In 2003, four Dutch NGOs, Cordaid, ICCO, Kirkinakti and Novib, conducted a joint national assessment of development progress in Rwanda. It was followed by the publication of its important findings alongside practical recommendations charting the way forward. Based on the reports, general remarks and calls were voiced demanding for aid freeze from the Dutch cooperation. It was recommended to stop any Dutch humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. It could only be resumed under the condition of establishing a fair justice, especially by carrying out independent investigations into the disappearance of 5 people in early 2003, among whom there were key political figures blacklisted as opponents to the ruling Rwanda Patriotic Front (RPF). Besides, it was further suggested to condition the release of Dutch aid on credible explanations by the government of Rwanda regarding allegations by a UN team pinpointing the role Rwanda had played in the illegal exploitation and plundering of natural resources in the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The joint NGO's paper was a 62-page monitoring report of activities carried out in Rwanda over that period. It was entitled "Tell Our Government It Is Okay to Be Criticized," and it was released on the 10th of February 2003 in The Hague. The report provides a comprehensive account of the benchmark criteria guiding the evaluation exercise, as well as the required recommendations that should be implemented in order to make aid possible in a context conducive to an effective development process. After 2003, we are compelled to stare the reality in the face, the NGOs declared in a joint statement introducing the report. As this report will show, space for political debate has nearly disappeared and a climate of fear, abuse of power and exclusion is now dominating in Rwanda, they added. The report also sounded an alarm urging the Dutch government to be coherent with the Rwandan government by consistently challenging its stance with regards to the systematic violations of human rights violations and other red flags of the tightening of political power. The dialogue needs to be more regular and stricter, the report read as one of the proposed recommendations. Based on the Dutch NGO's joint report's revelations, one may be entitled to assert that the Dutch government had embarked on funding a regime showing early signs of slipping onto a politically oppressive tread.
11th of March 2005, the government of Rwanda and the government of Netherlands signed a Memorandum of Understanding, MO, which set out the roadmap for development partnership and provided a framework for mutual dialogue and accountability. Strikingly, none of the critical issues pointed out in the Dutch NGO's joint report could be taken into consideration. In contrast, the Dutch government turned a blind eye to the report's allegations and pumped in more money, thus further helping to consolidate and strengthen the institutions of an oppressive regime. The second multi-annual strategic plan of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands for Rwanda covered the years 2008 to 2011. The total portfolio budget allocated to Rwanda operations amounted €137 million. It should be revealed that the initial budgeted amount for the General Budget Support Program for the year 2008 to 2009 was significantly less, that is, only €7 million. According to a publication in the Reuters newspaper of 12th of July 2012, a spokesperson for the Dutch Foreign Ministry announced she had suspended €5 million in aid the Dutch Bilateral Cooperation Agency originally reserved to improving Rwanda's judicial system. She however clarified that the support mechanism to non-governmental organizations based in Rwanda would not be affected by the decision.
In stunning twist, 3 weeks later the Dutch ambassador to Rwanda, Frans Matken, announced that contrary to media reports, his government had not suspended aid to Rwanda because there was no aid due for disbursement. Ambassador Frans Matken clarified this after bidding farewell to President Kagame, after his tour of duty had come to an end. Until today, it is still puzzling to understand how an ambassador could dare publicly contradict an official declaration by the foreign desk in The Hague from which he receives orders. For which reasons? Could one surmise it could be because the Kagame person is so terrifying the ambassador couldn't afford to face him angry? Dutch ambassador to Rwanda also made the following observations. What happened is that the Dutch government decided that it will not make any decision on aid until Rwanda pronounces itself on the UN accusations. We think that Rwanda has made an extremely serious response that has satisfied us. Rwanda has been serious and open about everything and has been seen to be keen on finding a solution, and we think that things might change in the coming weeks. Obviously, this was a twisted declaration. Once again, that was also not true, because nothing changed. There could be only one plausible explanation. Either The Hague was not satisfied by the Rwanda response to accusations of fueling conflicts in DRC, illegal resource exploitation, and spoliation, as reported by the UN, or there was another justification. After the donor community unanimously suspended aid to Rwanda as a condemnation of the pervasive presence of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the Dutch government presumably did not want to remain the only donor government continuing to provide the budget support to a beleaguered country.
From that time onward, Dutch aid reactivated the sector budget support. According to the Dutch Ministry for Development Cooperation, the support was streamlined for the rehabilitation of the justice sector through institutional capacity building of the Rwandan Ministry of Justice. The capacity building framework covered both the training and overhead costs, such as payment of salaries of the civil servants. It was a strategic action aimed at maintaining and enabling the local capacity to compete effectively with more profitable economic sectors. One important component of the project concerned reinforcing the rural police. It was designed to enable the government of Rwanda manage to enforce law and order as well as combat impunity. The penitentiary sector also benefited a portion of the Dutch aid. In this regard, a genocide fugitive tracking unit could also manage to run operations thanks to the Dutch taxpayers' money. Its role is to track suspects accused of crimes of genocide. Meanwhile, alongside the Dutch government's sustained support to Rwanda, numerous special reports as well as annual reports by international human rights organizations were released, all unequivocally pointing to the anti-democratic practices and human rights abuses increasingly becoming a new established norm in Rwanda. Among the organizations that sounded the alarm you find the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, Freedom House, Committee to Protect Journalists, and many others. The donor community governments have been consistently notified of what was going on in Rwanda. Moreover, U.S. State Department and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom reports on human rights situation in Rwanda have also consistently confirming the general positions of the previous Dutch NGOs' reports and in many cases coming with new insights purporting to realities worse than previously recorded. Several consistent reports unanimously pointed out the following issues. Freedom of speech and media nearly inexistent. Political space and dissident voices systematically suppressed. Abuse of power by law enforcement forces have become a norm. Widespread fear in the general population. Lack of independence of the judiciary, with systematic obstruction of the justice system by state organs.
In line with the previous assertions, for example, the country report produced by the U.S. Department of State Human Rights in 2020 on the state of the human rights in Rwanda is quite revealing. It read as follows: outcomes in high-profile genocide, security, and politically sensitive cases appeared predetermined. Some lawyers were reluctant to work on politically sensitive cases, fearing harassment and threats by government officials, including monitoring of their communications. State security forces continued to coerce suspects into confessing guilt in security. Related cases. Judges tended to accept confessions obtained through torture despite defendants' protests, and failed to order investigations when defendants alleged torture during their trial. The judiciary sometimes held security-related terrorism and high-profile political trials in closed chambers. Some defense attorneys in these cases reported irregularities and complained judges tended to disregard the rights of the accused when hearings were not held publicly. Some opposition leaders and government critics faced indictment under broadly applied charges of genocide incitement, genocide denial, inciting insurrection or rebellion, or attempting to overthrow the government. The previous year, in 2019, the U.S. State Department on Human Rights report had released the following unsparing declaration. Rwanda security forces regularly arrested and detained persons arbitrarily and without due process. The law provides for the right of persons to challenge in court the lawfulness of their arrest or detention. However, few tried, and there were no reports of any detainees succeeding in obtaining prompt release or compensation for unlawful detention. Then each report produced each year from 2013 onwards added up gruesome details that are both shocking and painful to read. Most particular with regards to allegations of unfair trials with political motivated charges. Amnesty International reported them extensively as part of organization's yearly reports since 2000. To this end, resourceful information database is readily available for public consultation. However, I would not recommend anyone with an extreme sensible heart to read them, for their revelations are painstakingly repulsive.
By comparing randomly any of the most recent reports with the early 2000 report compiled by the 4 Dutch NGOs calling for the end of support to Rwanda due to human rights violations, you simply realize that the level of human rights abuses in Rwanda has increased exponentially since that time. Moreover, in many cases methods used to both conceal and cover up malpractices have equally been increasingly sophisticated. One of the methods utilized includes the use of relentless fear-mongering, terrorizing and imprisonment of political opponents on fabricated claims, most of which come in the form of politically motivated charges. For example, across last 3 presidential elections, held in 2003, 2010 and 2017, for each presidential run-up won by the incumbent President Paul Kagame, most of the presidential candidate hopefuls were either arrested or incarcerated. Elsewhere, the leader of opposition political party would be beheaded. The arrest of Dr. Theoneste Nitigika in 2003, Victoire Ingabire Umuhuza in 2010 and Diane Rwigara in 2017 remain the most memorable examples of political repression in the history of Rwanda. It's in this perspective that Andre Kagwa Rwizarika was beheaded in 2010. To make matters worse, cases involving assassinations, disappearance, and abductions of political opponents both inside and outside of Rwanda have been dramatically increasing. Along the process, Rwanda became the only African country in history known to extremely engage in aggressive manhunt, kidnapping and assassination of its exiled political opponents and critics outside of its borders. Accordingly, cases of assassinations and assassination attempts have been recorded in Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Mozambique, Cameroon, Belgium, and United Kingdom. Equally, situations of kidnapping have been recorded in Uganda, Zambia, UAE, Kenya, Mozambique, and Comoros. Fortunately enough, most of the abduction, assassination, and assassination attempt operations, be it in Rwanda or outside of it, have been well recorded and published and openly disseminated for the wider public knowledge.
Among cases the likes of the previous ones, it's worth highlighting the peculiar kidnapping situation of the most recent and high-profile kidnapping operation. Indisputably, it remains to a large extent the most outstanding abduction case to date and a living demonstration of how oppressive regimes won't spare any means to violate the rights of whom they suspect as a number one threat to their regime. It's about the kidnapping of Paul Rusesabagina from in the United Arab Emirates in August 2020. History shall remember Rusesabagina as mythical figure in the history of Rwanda for having inspired an Oscar-nominated movie Hotel Rwanda. As a matter of fact, the Hotel Rwanda movie narrative is based on his real-life story events, when he was an acting manager of a hotel in Rwanda when the April 1994 genocide took place. The movie recounts his heroic actions to save lives of Tutsi families inside the hotel he was in charge of. Then on a fateful day, he was trapped, abducted from the United Arab Emirates, and forcefully flown back to Rwanda without realizing what was going on. Once in Rwanda, after many days of illegal detention, he was brought before justice where he was found with 9 counts of charges, among which terrorism and conspiracy to start an armed group. Once Paul Rusesabagina was under Rwandan police custody, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, hastened to publicly condemn Paul Rusesabagina, alleging he was indeed guilty of the charges. Wasn't this a conspicuous demonstration of blatant obstruction of justice? In fact, with such a declaration, one may easily assert that they effectively obliterated his right to be presumed innocent. Rwandan Justice Minister Johnston Basinga admitted in an interview with Al Jazeera in February 2021 that the government had paid for the private jet used to carry out the kidnapping operation. It should be recalled that Kigali organized his kidnapping after the international arrest warrant issued against him had been disregarded by both the Belgian and American authorities. It had been rejected because it lacked substance and rather carried a hallmark of political motivation. After a number of judiciary hearings, Rusesabagina announced that he would not attend any trial processes going forward, explaining that there was no way he could expect fair justice from the judiciary proceedings. His international lawyers were prohibited to come to Rwanda, and the only one who was allowed to enter was deported few days after his arrival. On the 11th of February 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution which was endorsed by the majority of Dutch members sitting in the European Parliament. It had 15 points, which summarized the European Parliament positioning on the above-mentioned matter in Rwanda. Among the adopted resolution, you could read: the European Parliament condemns the enforced disappearance, illegal rendition, and incommunicado detention of Paul Rusesabagina. Urges the Rwandan authorities to ensure the separation of administrative, legislative, and judicial powers, in particular the independence of the judiciary. On the 20th of September 2021, Paul Rusesabagina was sentenced to 25 years in jail. In a response to the Rwanda judiciary condemnation of Rusesabagina, the European Parliament adopted a new resolution on the 5th of October 2021. Like the previous resolution adopted last February, it was also endorsed by the majority of Dutch members sitting in the European Parliament. A total of 15 points were formulated to summarize the European Parliament positioning on the Rusesabagina case as part of general appeal towards the Rwandan government to sanitize its political space and judiciary system by guaranteeing fundamental human rights. Parts of the resolutions formulated read as follows: the European Parliament strongly condemns the arrest, illegal detaining, and conviction of Rusesabagina, which violates international and local standards. Considers the case of Paul Rusesabagina to be an element of a wider Rwandan policy focusing on the silencing of persons critical of the regime. Calls for the immediate and unconditional release of Rusesabagina and the immediate release of the rest of the other prisoners of conscience. Denounces the Rwandan authorities' restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms and the arbitrary use of pre-trial detention for repressing dissent. Deplores the overall human rights situation in Rwanda, and in particular the targeted persecution of dissenting voices and the closure of the democratic space. Deeply concerned by the use of the criminal justice system in a manner which erodes confidence in the judiciary.
Among many existing cases relating to restrictions of the political space and oppression of critics, a particularly vocal political case which in addition is closely linked to the Netherlands is worth sharing with you. It involves Ms. Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza, who was a Rwandan woman living in the Netherlands, before she decided to leave all behind including her family and career, to return to Rwanda in January 2010. She intended to get involved in the political transformation of her country. Once in the country, she followed all formality procedures required for registration of a political party. She planned to contend for the 2010 presidential elections. Her dreams were instantly foiled because she was later arrested and imprisoned. In September 2012, Ms. Umuhoza, while in prison, she was nominated as a potential beneficiary by the European Parliament of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. She was later sentenced to 8 years in prison. Daniel Bekele, director for Africa in the Rights Watch at that time, made the following remarks: "The courts should not be used for such political purposes," before adding, "Several factors lead us to conclude that Ingabire did not receive a fair trial. They include the politically motivated charges, such as genocide ideology, doubts about the reliability of some of the evidence, senior government officials' public statements before the trial about Ingabire's guilt, and broader concerns about the lack of independence of the Rwandan judiciary in politicized cases." The Amnesty International, which followed the trial, closely reported that despite international scrutiny, the trial was marred by violations of due process. The court failed to test evidence brought by the prosecution. Confessions of two co-accused incriminating Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza were made after a prolonged period of detention in a military camp, where Amnesty International has documented allegations of the use of torture to coerce confessions. A defense witness claimed he had been held in military detention with one of the co-accused and alleged that the individual's confession had been forced. On 6 October 2016, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on the case of Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza. Among other points, the resolution strongly condemned politically motivated trials, the prosecution of political opponents, and the prejudging of the outcome of the trial. Most of Dutch members of the European Parliament supported the resolution. On 24 November 2017, the African Court on Human and People's Rights held that Rwanda violated Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza's right to freedom of opinion and expression as well as her right to adequate defense. For the African Court, the criminal conviction and sentence imposed on Ingabire for her speech, incurring charges of minimizing the genocide, was a disproportional and unnecessary restriction on her freedom of speech. However, the court further found that the law criminalizing the minimization of genocide may impose a legitimate restriction on the right to freedom of expression, for purposes of preserving public order and national security.
Among many existing cases of assassinations, the killing of a high-profile military and political figure that occurred in South Africa on the 1st of January 2014 is worth sharing with you. Colonel Patrick Karegeya was the former head of Rwanda External Intelligence Services. He later fell out with the Rwandan regime, and he was illegally incarcerated twice in Rwanda before exiling to South Africa in 2007. In April 2019, the South African police made a public announcement that criminal investigation reports concluded that the suspects in the murder of Colonel Karegeya and other several assassination attempts could be directly linked to the involvement of the Rwandan government. On the 17th of February 2020, a popular Rwandan gospel singer and reconciliation activist, Kizito Mihigo, was found dead in his police detention cell. The official police notice claimed that he had committed suicide, and the police denied any independent investigation into the causes of his death. Most presumably, it's highly likely he was slain by the legal enforcement forces. As matter of fact, there was a precedent to the Kizito death. In one of his songs, Kizito praised the merits of commemorating the killings from both sides. He emphasized the importance of honoring all the victims of the past Rwandan tragedies, without segregating the ones that fell under the current regime forces. For late Kizito, it was the only way true and sustainable reconciliation could be reached. More importantly, it would help create an environment where learning from the past could be possible, thus helping to avoid falling back into the traps of the Rwandan dark history. In all likelihood, it looks like President Kagame was infuriated by the singer's stance on reconciliation and commemoration matters. Merely because in Rwanda there's a tacit norm prohibiting anyone from ever referring to killings orchestrated by the current regime. On the 25th of September 2020, being a first of its kind in history, Kizito Mihigo became the first person to be awarded a posthumous Vaclav Havel Prize for Creative Dissent. It is an international award that celebrates artists working under extremely restrictive conditions. All the previous narratives provides a well-documented track record of what one can learn about the government of Rwanda in relation to delivery of justice, rule of law, human rights, freedom of expression and assembly, as well as political space over the past 20 years.
To sum up, here are the key characteristics of the country's justice institutions as well as law enforcement agencies, which were heavily funded to the tune of millions of euros by the Dutch taxpayers. Use of torture to coerce confessions. Restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms. Enforced disappearance and illegal rendition. Violation of international and local legal standards. Stoking climate of fear. Politically motivated trials. Systematic abuse of power. Hijacking courts to serve political interests. Kidnapping of political opponents. Assassination and assassination attempt of political opponents. Manhunt of vocal political and activist figures living in exile. Despite the above grim picture, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Kigali could not shy at making a public declaration such as the following. The Dutch added value in the justice, reconciliation, law and order sector is recognized by all stakeholders. On the government of Rwanda side, there is satisfaction with the long-lasting support which has moved from successful projects in the past to sector budget support. Honestly, what kind of value addition did the embassy help create? As things stand, and based on our previous narrative presentation, it is clearly not a positive one. By all accounts, it would not be overstatement to assert with great confidence that the Dutch taxpayers' money has been an important funding component, used in strengthening the roots of oppression in Rwanda.